Chapter 6. Irrational Man. As we have noted, man in the modern worldview began by viewing himself, in Descartes, as a pure thinking substance, and now he regards himself at best as an irrational animal. The consequences of this are everywhere with us. Van Til has commented with respect to the Arminian view of the mind of man as independent from any ultimate decree of God that, quote, Arminianism has been untrue to the biblical point of view with respect to this matter. We usually think of Arminianism first of all with respect to its denial of the biblical teaching of the sinner's inability. However, back of the error of Arminianism at this point lies the error to which we are now calling attention, namely that it starts with the human consciousness as an ultimate instead of a derivative starting point. Arminianism has in principle denied the biblical concept of creation. This is its basic error and the source of all its other errors. So, for instance, Professor Donald Mackenzie, in his article on, quote, free will, end quote, in the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, says that the trouble with Augustinianism and Calvinism is that it has started with the idea of an absolute God and deduced the doctrine of decrees from it, while in reality we should start from experience and adjust the concept of the absoluteness of God's grace as best as we can do it. It is this assumption of human experience as an ultimate starting point that has now led into the further error of the acceptance of modern irrationalism in the form of paradox theology, end quote. Having cut loose from God and from the world as God's creation, man now denies that philosophy can create or maintain the possibility of a system of thought. Since no pattern exists in the world of brute factuality, a system cannot be derived from it, because a system implies an absolute decree undergirding reality and giving it a pre-established pattern. Thus, Dr. Joseph Haratunian, in his inaugural address as Cyrus H. McCormick Professor of Systematic Theology, proceeded to deny the very idea of systematic theology. He held that systematic theology forces reality onto a Procrustean bed which disfigures and mutilates readily in order to compel it to conform to a system, quote, systematic theology, end quote, aping science has been dogmatic, for it has refused to subject the, quote, essence of religion, end quote, to criticism. It has been speculative because its, quote, rigorous deductions, end quote, have not been open to genuine verification. And when not sure of its own rationality, it has turned mystical or pragmatic, thus ensuring itself against intellectual criticism. And it has also been irrelevant, for no system does itself justice to the complexities of human life. Existence is commerce with contingency, and ethical decision is a leap into the unknown. Hence, the application of any system of theology to the infinite vicissitudes of life can only be partial and problematic. For these reasons, theology has earned a common reputation of pompous dullness. Now, I regret this as much as anyone here, and I promise you to do something about the matter. As a foretaste of my coming labours towards making the theology a more illuminating and therefore more interesting affair, I offer you the following reflections. The first step towards a non-boring theology consists in recognizing that, quote, systematic theology, end quote, is an illusion, end quote. Scripture declares of the God of Scripture that known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world, end quote, Acts 15:18. St. Paul says of God's eternal decree, quote, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified. Romans 8:28-30, end quote. For such a God, predestination is an inescapable consequence of his sovereign power in creation. A system is thus also inescapable because God's eternal decree absolutely controls all things. To eliminate systematic theology requires eliminating such a God, or to retain him only as a limiting concept. This Rushdoony does, quote, "The living God," end quote, of the Bible defies literal statement. It is analogical insofar as God must be conceived in the likeness of life as we know it. The biblical man, whose reflection concerned existence and destiny, and not, quote, "intellectual objects," end quote, spoke of the mysterious intruder, fittingly as the, quote, "living God," end quote. The living, powerful, encountering and acting God, who is responsive to man, and to whom man is responsible, must be metaphorical, a carryover, a projection from nature. God is not a thing among things, and does not live in the likeness of the creature. If God is living, according to all we know about life, he must have been born, and one day he will have to die. But the God of the Bible is eternal, therefore he is living in a metaphorical sense. God is literally neither living nor non-living. Quote, "The living God," end quote, is thus a poetic expression. It is ambiguous, not in the sense of being vague or diffuse, but in that its signification is complex and inexhaustible. It is poetic, not in the sense of being fanciful, but in that it is imaginative, evoking an image which forbids identification with the real. The biblical mind, which recognized God as the creator of nature and not a thing in it, was free from the sophisticated confusion between existence and, quote, "pure thought," end quote, filled its discourses on God with images from nature, determined not to identify God with anything in, quote, "heaven above or in earth below or in the sea," end quote. The image both affirms and denies its likeness to the imagined. Therefore, biblical language is continually paradoxical. A paradox is a tension between thesis and antithesis, an affirmation and a denial. It is also two images in opposition, pointing to their harmony in God, such as the loving God and the wrathful God, which insist upon their reconciliation in the hidden God. A paradox in the Bible is truth which can only be perceived in the form of a contradiction bearing witness to its own superficiality. Hence, it constrains the mind to dig into its meaning, with the promise of indefinite penetration and clear warning that the quest is endless and its goal beyond all intellocution. Thus it is that the Bible remains a source of illimitable insight into existence and a whirlpool in which all systems are drawn into the mystery of God. Now, what happens when our science-possessed system-making theologians set out to, quote, "translate," end quote, the language of the Bible into another, which shall be free from symbol and metaphor, from the contamination of image and emotion, precise, literal, and unparadoxical? If they carry out the task they undertake, and we find our theological scientists consistently refusing to do so, their translations are in fact mistranslations. The, quote, "living God," end quote, of the Bible becomes the first cause, or ultimate being, or a value-producing factor in the universe, or the principle of a living mind in its intercourse with God. But as translations of, quote, "the living God," end quote, they are misrepresentations of biblical religion. The notion of the first cause has no context except if one smuggles some into it from the paradox-ridden world of experience. Quote, "ultimate being," end quote, is another paradoxical notion hovering between the idea of a being, which turns God into an idol, and the idea of, quote, "being in general," end quote, which is the undefinable least common denominator of all being, end quote. In this address, we have the major currents of modern thought and modern theology very plainly set forth. Let us examine a few of the more relevant ones which are of concern to our interest. First, Rushdoony denies the validity of the term, quote, "the living God," end quote, except as a metaphor. For him, quote, God is literally neither living nor non-living, end quote. He also holds that, quote, "if God is living, according to all that we know about life, he must have been born, and one day he will have to die," end quote. This is a most revelatory point. Clearly, Rushdoony did not look to Scripture for knowledge, but to human experience exclusively, that is, quote, to all that we know about life, end quote. The meaning of life, thus, is understood in terms of man, not God. The limits of life are the limits of human experience. If man, who has life, dies, it follows that all life dies. This is anthropomorphism with a vengeance. Rushdoony has done more than renounce systematic theology. He has renounced theology in any form for anthropology. Man is his new creator, interpreting life in terms of the limits of his own life and experience. The humanistic scientist says, quote, what my net does not catch is not fish, end quote, and thus defines factuality only in terms of its preconceived limitations, which are designed to eliminate God-created factuality. Rushdoony says that any life that transcends man's life and experience cannot be life. His idea of God, quote, forbids identification with the real, end quote, so that we do not have the living God of Scripture who performs great miracles and absolutely predestines and governs all things, but a limiting concept. Second, Rushdoony insists that, quote, the biblical mind, end quote, was in some way, quote, free from the unsophisticated confusion between existence and, quote, pure thought, end quote, end quote. This is an amazing statement. It reads back into the Bible the sophisticated distinctions and confusions of modern epistemology and calls, quote, the biblical mind, end quote, an essentially post-Kantian mind. For Rushdoony, existence means a world of meaningless brute factuality, and pure thought or reason has no relationship to such a world. Meaning and non-meaning cannot be confused. To think of God as, quote, out there, end quote, is thus for him impossible. It ascribes meaning to a realm of non-meaning and projects as an entity into the outer world something which cannot be thought of as being, life, or substance. This is simply reading the Bible in terms of Immanuel Kant, and Rushdoony's, quote, biblical mind, end quote, is the mind of a devout disciple of Kant. Third, he insisted that, quote, biblical language is continually paradoxical, end quote. That is, it is not an actual description of reality, it is imagery, and, quote, the image both affirms and denies its likeness to the imagined, end quote. Quote, the imagined, end quote, is a good name for the God of modern theology. Why is biblical language always paradoxical? A paradox, he explained, is a tension between thesis and antithesis, between two images in opposition. It is an affirmation and a denial, quote, a contradiction bearing witness to its own superficiality, end quote. We are thus plainly in the world of dialectical theology. The Bible is not dialectical. Greek philosophy, scholasticism, and modern philosophy are all dialectical. To project the problem of dialecticism onto the Bible is to refuse to take the Bible on its own claims and statements. It is an insistence that it can only be read with the mind of a post-Kantian man. Truth is beyond, quote, all intellocution, end quote, for such a mind because the reality, quote, out there, end quote, is beyond reason and meaning, as well as beyond life, and is therefore beyond truth, which is inseparable from reason and meaning. All we have is, quote, the mystery of God, end quote, in a post-Kantian sense as that which is without meaning or pattern. Because this non-living God is beyond intellocution, beyond truth and meaning, very obviously this God is also beyond any possible system. Systematic theology is, by definition, an impossibility. Fourth, since this God of dialecticism is beyond system and meaning and beyond life, to speak of him as, quote, ultimate being, end quote, is to turn God into an idol, a fact or a thing. To speak of God as the first cause or any kind of cause is to place him in that outer world of brute factuality and to insist on a meaning governing that world. Rushdoony wants only a reflective theology which will use God as a limiting concept. Theology cannot be, quote, scientific, end quote, that is, a form of knowledge or a body of knowledge, because we have no knowledge of God, no deposit of truth in Scripture that we can know as a true account of the real and living God. Theology must be divorced from science, which means that it must cease to be systematic, because the idea of a system requires a universe of total meaning governed by absolute rationality. Quote, let us therefore call a halt to theology which is, quote, hell-bent, end quote, for quote-unquote science and the system. I deny that theology can be scientific because God is not a thing among things. I deny that systematic theology is possible because the paradoxes of the Christian faith signify the mystery of God who resists inclusion in any, quote, system of nature, end quote. The time has come to do away with the error and arrogance of, quote, scientific, end quote, theology and system making, and to break this stranglehold of a theological method which has for too long devitalized the mind of the Church, end quote. Such a statement is a remarkable instance of the arrogance of modern irrational man who has devitalized the Church and blames the Christians for doing it. It is an irrational mind by its own willful desire. As Knight has observed, quote, the, quote, irrationality, end quote, quote-unquote despair and so forth of modern thought reside precisely in its refusal to believe in the possibility of system, end quote. One consequence of this irrationality is the idea of the absurd. The source of the absurd is the contrast between the unintelligible, irrational and meaningless nature of the world around us and man's reason. Camus declared, quote, I said that the world is absurd, but I was too hasty. This world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. For the moment, it is all that links them together. It binds them one to the other as only hatred can weld two creatures together. This is all I can discern clearly in this measureless universe where my adventure takes place. End quote. An early forerunner of the idea of the absurd was Matthew Arnold, 1822 to 1888, who, in, quote, Dover Beach, end quote, wrote of the departure of meaning from the world as Christian faith waned. As surely as a receding tide leaves a draining shore behind it, so surely a waning Christian faith leaves behind it a world empty of all truth and meaning. In the concluding section of, quote, Dover Beach, end quote, Arnold wrote, quote, the sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges near, and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain, and we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. End quote. With Arnold, Camus, and others, there are still remnants of Christian faith which require them to, quote, be true to one another, end quote, and to maintain some kind of standard. But as irrational man presses the claims of the absurd on life, he forsakes all norms for a radically irrational lawlessness. Philosophically, it means that even a man like Heidegger, who wants no part of irrationality, still separates thinking from reason. According to Heidegger, quote, thinking only begins at the point where we have come to know that reason, glorified for centuries, is the most obstinate adversary of thinking, end quote. A Christian can affirm this, but in a different sense, in that he affirms the priority of the absolute rationality of God to the reason of man, but Heidegger, as an existentialist, wants thinking without reason, without a pre-established pattern or necessary meaning. In Sartre, this means that man simply is. Man has being, but no essence. In Audinick's words, quote, every man is a tabula rasa. He is nothing that can be defined beforehand, but must define himself through his life, end quote. In view of the studied irrationality of modern man, his cultivated barbarism, It is not surprising that lawlessness and immorality proliferate, nor that police report a growing incidence of, quote, senseless, end quote, and, quote unquote, purposeless crime. Crimes are committed for violence sake, a defiance of reason and order, and society sees an alarming increase in anarchy. This anarchy is not the isolation of great individuals, but the dissolution of all connecting ties other than the tyrant state between man and man. It produces, as the avant-garde dramatists of existentialism recognize, a weak man, a man who is helpless before authority and power because he is neurotic, timid, ulcer-ridden, and afraid. Wellworth observes with respect to the world of the dramatist Jean Tardieu, quote, in Tardieu, the modern mind, the mind, that is, of the ordinary man in the street, craves irresponsibility and therefore willingly and uncritically, almost by now instinctively, abases himself before the first vague semblance of authority that it encounters, end quote. Except in irresponsibility and violence, modern man, according to his own philosophers, is impotent and helpless. The dramatist Eugene Ionesco portrays the moral spinelessness of man in society and the readiness of men to justify evil rather than to oppose it. His character Berenger is given as an example of this. Quote, having no belief of his own, he represents a society that no longer has any right to defend itself against evil because it is not convinced that it is better than the evil opposing it. End quote. The result is rebellion. In the Ubu plays of Alfred Jarry, 1837 to 1907, this is rebellion on the most direct and elementary level, the scatological. It is comparable to, quote, a child's refusal to bow to the bathroom training, end quote. Jarry himself said of Ubu Roi that he, quote, is an ignoble creature, which is why he is so like us all. He is really rather a spoiled child, end quote. Jarry warred against realism in the theatre in the name of the new standard of rebellion. The nightmare of the inner world had to be depicted on stage. Wellworth tells us of the development of Jarry's own principle of rebellion. Quote, Jarry's greatest gesture of rebellion, however, was his alcoholism. There can be no doubt that he deliberately drank himself to death. Not long after his arrival in Paris, he must have made up his mind to make the supreme rebellious gesture of suicide. He chose alcohol as his medium because it was slow and because the immediate effects of the alcohol enabled him to carry on his eccentricities undisturbed by the restraints of his own personality. Alcohol freed him from himself temporarily. Eventually, it freed him permanently from the whole burden of his life. In a way, it was an heroic death, for it was a death for a cause, and probably it was not as pleasant a one as the casual drinker might suppose. It was certainly not an insane or unreasonable death. Rebellion, as Jarry saw it, was a quest for total freedom and a protest against the ultimate enslavement, which is death. Jarry chose to rebel against the ultimate by systematically destroying himself. In this way, he conquered, paradoxically, for having consciously sentenced himself to death, having decided to control his own death, as it were, by deliberately bringing it on, he was able to be completely at liberty, completely contemptuous of all manifestations of social order during the period of life that was left to him. End quote. A rational man seeks an irrational end.